Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Casey Harrod. I'm the current president for MACVPR. We've got Dr. O back with us today. He's going to be talking about the highs and lows of cannabis use in the rehab setting. We could not have timed this one any better with the recent polls that we just saw from what was just recently passed here in the state. So we're really anxious to hear this one from you, Dr. O. I'm hoping we got lots of questions with that. So just to do a quick housekeeping here for everyone, please use that Q&A field down below. You can use that throughout this presentation, and we'll circle back around to answer any questions you may have. So put those in the Q&A part, not the chat portion of this presentation. And you do get continuing ed for this presentation as well. Just remember to fill out that survey monkey we sent out. I also put it there in the chat comment as well if you do need it again, or you can reach out to myself or any of the other board members if you do need that. So Paul O is the medical director for the Good Life Fitness and the Good Life Fitness Chair in the Cardiovascular Disease Prevention and Rehabilitation Program at the University Health Network in Toronto. He's associate professor of the Department of Medicine, University of Toronto, and he's the past president for the Canadian Association of Cardiovascular Prevention and Rehabilitation. And yet again, Dr. O, congrats again for achieving your fellow with AACVPR this year. With that said, I'm going to kick it to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Casey, and thanks, Mike, for getting us linked together. It's indeed a pleasure to be back with you again. Once again, I wish we were actually together in person, but let's connect virtually at least. As Casey, you've indicated, this is a very timely topic for all of us, and I hope that we'll be able to take a few interesting things away from this session. My disclosures that I do serve on some advisory boards for 3 pharmaceutical companies that are listed here, and I'm an employee of our hospital. I don't think any of this will influence the content or presentation today. But we do have a few objectives, and I've got a fair bit of material, and hopefully you'll hang in there with me as we go through this. By the end of this, I hope that you'll have some appreciation of the pharmacology of cannabis. The particular active ingredients that we often focus on are THC and CBD. That may be completely familiar to all of you, but maybe for a few that this will be something new. Certainly our patients need to know more about this. Let's talk a little bit about medical evidence for or against. And think about the scenarios where cannabis conversations are going to arise, especially given recent events. And then focus in on the cardiovascular system. No one's taking cannabis to help the heart. They may be taking it for other reasons, and we have to be aware of what those maybe unintended effects on the cardiovascular system might be. For our pulmonary colleagues, let's talk a little bit about vaping and lung injury. And here's your bonus item for dinner tonight that, again, some of you may be able to speak more learnedly about this than I, but the one fun thing that you can do is talk about the difference between a Kush and a sativa over dinner tonight. Stories come up often, questions come up often in the cardiac rehab setting. And when I'm in the clinic, meeting people for the first time, entering cardiac rehab or fielding questions, these are not uncommon questions that come up. So these are real. So if a 55-year-old woman with coronary disease and diabetes who's suffering from terrible neuropathy, she may ask you what kind of cannabis is the one that she should use, given that it might be more widely available. I had this incident of a 65-year-old man who came in for a stress test. The staff told me that he's using an oil twice a day on a long-term basis, but he did take a hit of a joint in the parking lot. Should we have any concerns about this, and how do we explore this further? If a 35-year-old man shows up in your emergency department with acute coronary syndrome without any risk factors, and the only thing that seems to be in his medical history is that he frequently smokes cannabis, is there any relationship between the two? A 75-year-old man told me a story about how he went to hospital with delirium and tachycardia. Could this be cannabis related? And then finally, a 70-year-old woman who's had an MI, a PCI, and an aortic valve replacement in the past, is wondering, should she be taking CBD for all kinds of things, including her nerves and other concerns? So stories are common, and they're going to be more common. And I think this is also typified or illustrated by the interest in our sort of mainstream leading cardiology literature. So earlier this year in March, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology published this overview of marijuana use in people with CVD. So I'm going to give you two key references as well. So this is one that you might jot down, or you may have access to the slides later on. But in this issue of JACC, they went over in a very thoughtful way, kind of the ins and outs of marijuana use. And then interestingly, Circulation just a few weeks ago published an AHA scientific statement about medical marijuana, recreational cannabis, and cardiovascular health. So two of our leading cardiovascular journals are paying attention to this, and both are really excellent overviews. This one, I'll draw from this one a little bit more, and the JACC one as well, sprinkle them throughout. But this most recent article is a very nicely set up overview that includes epidemiology and pharmacology and benefits and safety and summary of studies and considerations in special populations. So it frames it nicely. This actual session is laid out in a very similar way, but you've got the color commentary from me as you go along. But if you want the sciencey statement, then you've got these two key references. Why is this relevant? And you know where this is going. With some trepidation, I'm showing you a map of the US. Indeed, over the last week or so, I've learned a great deal about the geography of where states sit as I've watched cable news. In the Circulation article, they spoke about the state policies regarding cannabis use as of September 20th. The darker the color, I guess, the more liberal the availability of cannabis would be. So the darkest ones represent the states where cannabis has indeed been legalized as of September 20th. And you'll see that in most states, there is some version of cannabis that is available either through medical or, quote, decriminalized mechanisms. But as Casey, you've highlighted that as of the November 20th elections, or the November elections, that 4 more states have indeed legalized marijuana. And what happens when that comes about? So it's just over 2 years ago that Canada as a whole nation legalized marijuana cannabis products. And I think there has been an appreciable uptick in interest in use that really sets the stage nicely for us. In the Circulation article, they speak to this, that there is a growing interest in use of marijuana. And compared to other sorts of substances that may be used and or abused and draw lots of attention, like stimulants like cocaine or opioids or amphetamines, those are clearly important and carry a high social burden. But it's interesting how widespread marijuana use is. And indeed, it's probably even wider than this because it's hard to get complete population data in this way. So suffice to say that there are lots of users of cannabis products. And from the JACC article, they called out this epidemiology that indicates that there are at least 2 million Americans living with cardiovascular disease who use cannabis on a regular basis. So these conversations will come up. And interestingly, depending on the week of our program, half the people walking through may kind of describe some cannabis use or cannabis interest. So the conversations are very common. So it leads me to these kinds of stories then as a backdrop. So what if someone in your program asks you what type of cannabis should she or he use because of things like neuropathy? So we can kind of look at this in kind of a systematic way. When cannabis became legal in our province of Ontario, for instance, there was even a store that was set up, both in online vehicles as well as on-site vehicles. And if you go to the website even now, it'll try to guide a consumer through some reasonable questions to ask. And what's interesting is that consumers may be guided and they may not know enough, but I would say the same thing for many healthcare practitioners. Do we have a system to this, and do we know enough? And would we know enough to kind of start the conversation about cannabis by asking some key questions like, what is in the product that you're interested in? What is the product? How much THC is there? How much CBD is there? What about the terpene content? And how are you going to use this? Will you smoke it? Will you vaporize it? Will you eat it? Will you drink it or put it in other places? How much are you going to take? And what really drives you to use this sort of thing? So I actually thought that's not a bad framework to start the conversation, but I might just take one step back and figure out what these things really are, just to put us on the same page moving forward in our conversation. So I'm sure lots of you have seen information like this, that of all of the many chemicals that can be found in a cannabis plant, like 400 plus things, 60 of them are called cannabinoids. And of those 60 cannabinoids, the two that we often focus upon are this one, THC, or delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. This is the stuff that gets you high. This is the stuff that people tend to like. And then on the other side, the predominant thing that we see that comes out of cannabis, but also other plants like hemp, is cannabidiol, or CBD. And many medical practitioners are interested in this in a big way for its medicinal properties, which are being explored in a big way. THC may have its own unique properties as well, and the combinations of the two are the kind of the art and science of cannabis as medicine. There are also many of these products that are called terpenes. So there's one new thing for some of you today. And to me, this is like the bouquet of a nice wine that you may like. Can you smell the oaks and tannins and leather and whatever fruity overtones that there might be? Well, this is the terpenes. And those of you who have smelled cannabis in any form, and I'm sure that there's a few of you online right now, it's got an kind of unmistakable, pungent kind of aroma, and then you might qualify it. If you're a wine connoisseur, you might be a cannabis connoisseur and say, smell those terpenes, aren't they lovely? The potential effects of THC and CBD are the things that are interesting. So THC binds to those CB1 receptors in the brain primarily, and that's why it's got this kind of neurologic sort of effect of kind of relaxing and altering sensations, and sometimes helping with sleep and helping with nausea, which is a nice medical application of THC, and it may be helpful in its pain relief sort of activities. CBD, on the other hand, doesn't stimulate this receptor. It modulates how it works. So taking it together with THC has this nice kind of balancing sort of effect. CBD on its own is very interesting from the medical perspective, as we said, for its kind of anti-anxiety, perhaps neuroprotective effects, perhaps anti-convulsant effects, and we can talk a little bit more about that, and pain relief and anti-inflammatory. So, this is a very complex story that's sometimes just brought down to these two chemicals, but obviously the plant is a whole lot more complex than just these two chemicals. And in the circulation article, they call out even more information about the kinds of formulations and the modes of administration. What impresses me about people who are motivated to use drug types of products is that they can be very creative about how you can take a plant and change it into all kinds of formulations. Take the plant itself, dry it down, and smoke it. That's I guess the most straightforward thing. But extracting it into wax or distillates or crystalline formulations, or shatter, so to speak, and then mixing that up and inhaling it or wiping it on you or into you is very interesting. And then extracting some of the elements from the plant into edibles, tinctures, and oils, and taking them orally, maybe more like of a medical kind of predictable way of getting certain product concentrations, and then looking at how we might take some of the products and put it into candy formulation to be taken in by mouth. We're aware of some of the synthetic cannabinoids. They're available by prescription, and some of them are more CBD in nature, some are mixed in nature. And then there's the scary stuff that's on the street, because again, people are very creative in the way that they might take their drug products, and kind of novel formulations of cannabinoids. These are the two that you might find out on the street, like K2 and spice. So they're kind of like the heavy hitters of THC like effects. So people might like it because it's such a high effect, but it can also be very dangerous because of its extreme effects. Much like with opioids, like if you're inadvertently getting an illicit high concentration opioid, that's the stuff that may lead to overdoses inadvertently and or death. So being aware that this is a complex arena again. So very simply in my mind, that if you take the products and inhale them, people like that because it's very quick to get your THC hit up into your brain. It comes on quickly, the concentration peaks very quickly and then wanes away. In distinction, if you take things orally, then it's going to be a slow rise in effect and it's going to last much longer. You don't get that immediate feedback of, look, I'm high, I better stop now. You just may take a dose and keep going. And it's not so clear about how any individual might respond to an oral dose of a cookie or a plant or whatever it might be that you're taking. In either case, the chemicals THC and metabolites are very lipid soluble. That means that they're going to hang around in the body for a long time. So that makes testing kind of challenging. And sort of drug testing, are you intoxicated now? Because we can detect a metabolite. That's very tricky. And it also it is borne out by secondhand exposures where you can pick up this stuff in fair concentrations. Even if you've been kind of exposed, but you're not a direct user. So that's some interesting background. What about strains? And you may have heard about strains. And again, the knowledgeable folks on the phone know a lot about strains. For others, strain, think about a plant, right? Think about tomato plants or whatever that, there's obviously many versions of a tomato plant, and there's very many versions of a cannabis plant as well. In older kind of literature, there was distinction made of a couple kinds of major strains. One would be indica, one would be sativa, and just kind of thinking of the distinctions. Indica is grown in colder environments up in the mountains. This is an example of a kush, or a kush is an example of an indica. Short and thick and darker green. So think about in the mountains how things are kind of compacted lower. And the purported kind of properties of an indica would be that it has a little bit less THC, more CBD, and it might be the one that kind of relaxes you and makes you sleepy. So kind of the calming down version, as opposed to the sativa that's grown in hotter areas. Think like Thailand, think like Southeast Asia, think like Central America, tall and thin and lighter green, growing up to the sun, more THC, more CBD, more stimulation, more euphoria. Those that are kind of committed to using cannabis as part of their life would say it helps with their focus and creativity and imagination. So, think about if you are using on a regular basis, or the recreational users that might be accessing products more in Montana in coming days and weeks. If you had a daytime choice, it might be something like a sativa, get you stimulated, get you going. At nighttime, you might switch over to the indica that will get you calmed down. And as I learned from a teenage member of my family, they would say indica is known as the one that puts you in the couch. So calming you down. And, again, folks can choose the stimulants or the relaxants that they might integrate into their day. So you can pick a strain. You can also pick what's the composition of those strains. So if you're using a plant, as we said, the strain may dictate which way it goes, how much THC, how much CBD. If you're using distillates or extracts of that, like in oils, you can also choose this. So we will ask the questions: what is the product that you're using? What's the strain of it? And then what's the composition of it? Is it mainly THC? So that's typically not so much medical kind of use, but it is very popular in recreational use? Or is it CBD dominant? Folks that are using these products for pain or other therapies will tend to be using more CBD. And then sometimes this is where you start and introduce a little bit more THC so that you might end up with a balanced product. So if you're looking at percentage content, CBD, THC, or milligram content, if it's an oil, then we will look for CBD dominant or balanced kinds of products as the main ones that might be recommended in the medical sphere. So there's lots of interest because there's many health applications. This is another nice kind of compendium of the literature that talks about the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, and kind of goes through many of the potential usages for pain or headaches or seizures or whatever it might be, and kind of looks at the balance of literature. I will say that there's many new articles that emerge every month about the potential applications, and the types of studies that are being done are improving over time as well. So refer you to that. But it says then that people will be interested, this woman will be interested because of that kind of background. And then the questions that we might ask, or the conversation we might have, is what type of cannabis should I use? We can talk about the products, we can talk about strain, we could talk about the balance of the chemicals that might be in there, and recommend that she might start with something that is CBD dominant. Think about using oils, and then you might start off with like 1 drop at bedtime, and then go to 2 drops, etc. And then once she gets balanced out, then it might be able to convert her into a fixed dose capsule. There are, however, many other caveats to follow. And this is the interesting parts of what is the connection of safety with cannabis and CBD that we need to talk about. So the main question for us going forward in the next 20 minutes or so is cannabis safe for the heart? Again, the circulation article from just a month ago itemizes this stuff very well. I will take a sampling of that that ranges from case reports to cohorts to overviews. I will say that there are no RCTs that have been done, like taking 1,000 people with MI, 1,000 giving them cannabis, and 1,000 no cannabis, and just seeing what's going to go on with that group. All right, so here's some of the data and walking it through. This review in the Annals of Internal Medicine from a couple of years ago, again, another big journal in the medical world being devoted to, or wanting to educate us about, cannabis. And their summary of the literature at the time said that if you look at a bunch of cannabis users at a point in time, it looks like on balance, these folks, interestingly, might have less diabetes and tendency to lower glucose and higher HDL. And, there was no real fixed pattern on BMI. So you might say, oh, this study says that cannabis users are indeed healthier, maybe. Now, of course, there's real bias in these kinds of cross-sectional studies. So then we need to couple this with kind of prospective information over time, which says that if you take a bunch of cannabis users and then follow them over years, what seems to be coming up is that the cardiovascular risks seem to deteriorate over time. And then we get into that kind of more typical view of regular pot users, eating more, getting munchies, not being active, gaining weight, developing diabetes, blood pressure going up, that sort of thing. So the information is mixed on that, but we wonder about cardiovascular risk in some of our populations if they are long-term users. And this study called Cardia, that was published in one of the big diabetes journal a few years ago, kind of spoke to this. And the main thing was that it seemed to be that for a frequent user, the risk of prediabetes as a condition was about 1.4-fold higher. So think about risk factors in the kind of the chronic cannabis users. What about on acute effects? So when the guy showed up for the stress test after having just taken a puff of a joint in the parking lot, is that a good thing? So that's not something we recommend anywhere, right? Even in Canada, but some people need to do these things for pain control or something else. So if someone has just smoked a joint or taken a few hits, what happens to them? And interestingly, there's an article from 30 years ago where 13 young men were paid to smoke a joint, and then their blood was sampled, and they did a few kind of tests of intoxication along the way. Here's the characteristic response when someone smokes a joint. They get drowsy, they get dry mouth, they get hungry, they may get some fluctuating neurologic kinds of symptoms. And then when you look at the pharmacokinetic and symptom graph in detail, so when you smoke a joint, the THC levels go up very rapidly and achieve a nice peak level. That's the THC black line at the top. The intoxication shown in green kind of parallels the amount of THC that is in one's body. So there's a tendency for more of those neurologic, euphoric or dysphoric symptoms that come up as the THC concentration goes up. But the interesting thing that we're pointing out here is also the cardiovascular response that may be there, that heart rate will go up by 30 or 40 beats in parallel to the THC concentrations. And then it'll take an hour or more for that to come back down. So if someone has just smoked a joint before their stress test, they've already stressed themselves out. Maybe not be the best time to run them on the treadmill. And we'll think about this as potentially an acute stressor in the setting of ischemic heart disease in this next study. So again, reaching way back in the literature, this now to New England Journal of Medicine, 1974. What's the effect of smoking marijuana in somebody who has angina? This was the most representative photo that I could find of that kind of scenario. In this case, very small study again, but you find 10 people living with angina, give them either a marijuana cigarette or a placebo cigarette. No surprise, when you smoke substances, whether it's tobacco or cannabis, there's going to be stressors in the body, and indeed, heart rate and blood pressure, pressure products will increase. There is an increase in carboxyhemoglobin because you're burning things and inhaling them into your lungs. There's an increase in myocardial oxygen demand, and at the same time, a decrease in delivery. And then, no surprise to you that their angina threshold will go down. And in this study, it went down by about 48%. So clearly, there is a stressor if you're smoking stuff, and smoking cannabis, cannot be deemed, quote, safe. It's just a plant. So you can cause more angina, but can you cause more things to happen if you follow this logic along? And in this study called The Determinants of Myocardial Infarction Onset, there were a few thousand people that were interviewed shortly after their MI. A few of them reported or admitted to smoking marijuana within an hour. And the authors kind of computed that the relative risk within that short window was indeed elevated quite a bit from smoking marijuana. And over the longer term, they suggested that there might be a risk as high as fourfold for people that smoked cannabis more than once a week. So is that cannabis, or is it smoking other things as well? Because often marijuana smokers were also tobacco smokers. So, clearly smoking things is not a good idea. And if you've got a heart problem, this is not a good idea as well. This has been looked at various meetings, like the annual ACC meeting from a couple of years ago. We're looking on larger population bases, that if you looked at a larger subset or a larger cohort now of cannabis users, like 200,000 of them matched to non-cannabis users, about 10 million of them, overall the suggestion was that the risk of MI could be close to doubled. And if you look at the age breakdown of this, so the red line is denoting the risk, the relative risk of MI for a cannabis user versus not. The green bars denote cannabis users, the incidence of MI, and the blue is incidence in the control. And you can see, especially for the younger folks, up to the age of 60, that there is an excess risk associated with the use of cannabis, and in particular in young folks who have no business really having myocardial infarctions. If the young folks are having them, then you wonder if cannabis might be part of their kind of habits, in quotation mark, and it might be contributing to their risk of MI. So that's an interesting sort of paradigm to bring forward, because the young people in particular, they may be presenting in unusual ways. And I present this case study as an exemplar of this. A 35-year-old dude shows up in your emergency department with chest pain after smoking a joint. This is the ECG that's shown, and all of us can appreciate, gosh, this looks terribly abnormal. ST depressions are seen across the lateral and inferior leads, across our anterior leads. We've lost SAR waves throughout. There's ST elevations in 1 and 2. There's deep ST depressions in V4 through V6. This looks like very widespread ischemia. And an echo is done in this guy because this is just pretty unusual. And this is the shape of his echo. That it's got this odd kind of balloon shape, and you'll see that the title of this slide, I've actually pulled out from my Takotsubo slide deck of this thing called stress cardiomyopathy, where I think we're all familiar with this syndrome called stress cardiomyopathy, where the shape of the heart represents something like a Japanese octopus trap. Very similar presentation to MI with chest pain and shortness of breath. We're familiar with this as typically something that affects older women who don't really have underlying significant obstructive coronary artery disease. But again, the interesting thing is that now this is showing up in young men. So in the large national inpatient registry of Takotsubo that includes over 33,000 individuals, when you look closely at the subset of marijuana users, that the use of marijuana seems to double the risk of Takotsubo, just like it did of MI overall, and that typically these were younger men with very few risk factors versus non-marijuana users. So interesting kind of phenotype that emerges of cannabis users, abusers, and the risk for specific myocardial events. What about the story that I was sharing with you of a 75-year-old man who was in our rehab program? And he told me that recently he had to be shipped off to hospital with delirium and tachycardia. Is this cannabis related? And then when we filled in the details, what he said was he was up at his lake house cottage. He found in the refrigerator something that looked like a chocolate bar, a Kit Kat bar. And it turned out that his son and friends had been partying at the cottage the weekend before and left behind what he thought were some nice goodies. So he took one of the Kit Kat bars, or what's shown here is a real example of how candy bars that are cannabis laced may emulate kind of brand bars. I think that's a terrible thing, of course, because it's terribly confusing, and vulnerable people who may be at all age spectrum may innocently take one of these things. And as we said with edibles, that you don't notice at the beginning that something is awry. It only happens later on. And this was the kind of the time curve of acute THC effects. With edibles, this is delayed by as much as 3 hours. So you'll have the one kind of slice of the chocolate bar, and who can ever stop at one? You'll have 2, you'll have 3, maybe you'll have all 4 pieces of the Kit Kat bar. And when you've done so, you'll notice an hour or 2 later that things may not seem so good. So the intoxication and the cardiovascular effects that were seen very early on, if you smoke it, may come on a little bit later on. And indeed, in the experience in places like Colorado, when they've been looking at people showing up in the emergency department post-cannabis exposures, what they have found that certainly because most people smoke products, that there's going to be more of that acute intoxication. But over time, there's also been this steady increase in medical events that have been associated with edible products. And when you really key on the cardiovascular symptoms that come up, or the acute emergency presentations, that with edibles, this is probably 2 to 3 times higher likelihood that you're going to present with cardiovascular crisis after having had edibles than inhalables. So just need to be aware of that and caution folks. It took a while, like a year and a half in Canada, for edibles to hit the marketplace after legalization. They may already be widely available in your state, but this is something to be kind of cautious about, certainly in our populations. And then finally, kind of rounding out the hit parade of bad things that may happen from acute cardiovascular presentations, again, was this kind of case story where a 34-year-old man presents with syncope, and when they get the kind of the ECG leads on him, he's found to be going in and out of ventricular tachycardia. He admits to marijuana use on a long-term basis, and kind of immediately before this event happened, admitted to cardiology, taken to the electrophysiology lab. They found that the VT was indeed inducible. They took him early to the cath lab thinking, well, gosh, if he's got a malignant arrhythmia, we want to make sure that he doesn't have significant obstructive coronary disease as well as a potential thing that could be modified. They saw that the anatomy looked quite fine, but the flow was very slow. Slow flow means less oxygen, means more irritable myocardium, which means you may get VT out of all of this stuff. And interestingly, just as the cannabis and metabolites kind of washed out of the system, everything seemed to go back to normal. So arrhythmia was something else that's seen. So a number of review articles. This is one from a few years ago. The Circulation article and the JACC article from this year kind of have their own versions of this, but they call out that there's many potential adverse cardiovascular effects that can happen that arise from increasing catecholamines on the short term that may increase heart rate, variably affect blood pressure, cause increased stress in the circulation, blood pressure effects, reduce blood flow that leads to things like angina, MI, death, cardiomyopathy, arrhythmia. Cerebral vascular events have also been observed. Peripheral vascular events have also been observed. So it's just a plant is one thing that people may say. In our populations whom we serve, who may have compromised circulation, compromised vascular systems, it may not just be just the plant. We should be just aware of all these things that could arise. Beyond this, are there any other concerns that we could think about? Well, of course, the answer is yes. So one thing is just on a kind of a base, on a drug basis of what's been going on. And this is from a few years ago from data from the I guess C specimens that were in the hands of the DEA and folks analyzing THC. And I think you've heard this in other venues that just, what might have been the perceptions of marijuana or cannabis from years ago, that it's a safe, happy plant, to now seeing that the concentrations of THC have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. What's out there is not the same as, quote, your grandmother's pot. Things are rather different. And, for our perspective of if THC is the thing that might incite some of our cardiovascular side effects, then the plant products that are available right now have much potentially higher effect on people living with heart disease. Another thought, that there is a very strong correlationship between cannabis use and tobacco use. And in this article from the journal Addiction from a few years ago, when they surveyed populations, they found that many smokers are willing to try out cannabis, but that's at a rate of about 11 or 12%. But many cannabis users are also smokers. So 90% of cannabis users are also tobacco users. And, the tremendous efforts that we in the cardiac rehab community that have undertaken alongside all of our public health colleagues to try to reduce people smoking, if they are instead flipping now to cannabis use, then the smoking rates may also rise for tobacco as well. And of course, we're concerned about youth with all of this stuff also. There are other adverse health effects, and this article from the New England Journal from a few years ago talked about some of the pulmonary effects in particular, risking rates of infection, wondering about cancer. This is equivocal. Some will say THC, CBD may be helpful for cancer. Others will say that it might be bad. It might all be tied to smoking and use of tobacco as well. But it's hard to say that this is perfectly benign. And this phenomenon of e-cigarette e-cigarette and vaping associated acute lung injury certainly has been in the news, more so last year than this year. I think we probably got other issues to talk about this year, but it's still out there. And young people showing up in emergency or being hospitalized and put into intensive care with terrible kind of consolidation, alveolar damage, pneumonia that's very unusual and diffuse. These things have been seen in all too many people throughout the United States. And it's interesting that, some of the dark spots are where, obviously there's greater use of cannabis as well. And as of February, 2,700 people were hospitalized with e-cigarette associated lung injury. And when one looked in particular at what was causing this, then it was not uncommonly THC containing e-cigarettes or vaping products that were the culprit here. So relevant to this conversation of cannabis products, that this is also the stuff that's been implicated in the majority of the lung injury kinds of issues. And then finally, in terms of a syndrome or a story that for me has been concerning, and I'm going to tap myself on the shoulder and say, hey, I've been talking about this for a couple of years now. Some of my formal training is actually in pharmacology, and we like to think about how drugs and other products can interact. So if I present you this story of a 70-year-old woman who's had ischemic events, also has a mechanical AVR. She's got a whole host of other symptoms, including headaches and neuropathy and sleep, and that's difficult, and lots of stress. And because of legalized frameworks in Montana or in Canada, she may be going to a store and saying, "What's the best pot for me?" And someone may innocently give her a story, right? And we've heard, oh gosh, it's don't smoke stuff. THC can be bad for your heart. So here's my answer for you: use some CBD. And listening to some American radio, and CBD commercials are certainly not uncommon as a panacea for all things that ail you. Predictably, she would have a complex medical regimen that would contain all of these things. If you and I were together and I could see you, I could ask you, is this a typical medical regimen? And I think you would say, yeah, she's on an antiplatelet drug and something for her heart and blood pressure, and she's on a statin, and maybe something for pain like amitriptyline, and she's taking acetaminophen and codeine for pain relief, and because she has a mechanical valve, she's anticoagulated with warfarin. Looks like a typical cocktail. So what's the deal if I suggest let's add some CBD into this mix as well? Well, let me take a slight sidebar for 2 minutes and just remind us that the complex pharmacologic regimen she's on will need to go somewhere in her body, and typically most drugs that we ingest, shown kind of in the red circle, are drug molecules that come in by mouth through the stomach, picked up in the intestinal circulation, come up through the portal vein and into a liver cell like this. And the job of the liver, when I tell this story to patients, I say the job of the liver is to take all of those drugs and transform them into another form along the way so that you can actually pee them out of your body. This is the circle of life of a drug. Bring in something, eliminate it from your body. Now that this, with some minor variations, this is the thing that happens. And in the center of this is this system called P450. You'll see this if you pick up a pharmacology textbook. This is what's called phase 1 metabolism, where you attach things like hydroxyl groups or glucuronide groups onto the drug and make it into a form that you can pee out of the body. Circle of life. Okay, so the P450 system must be really important and central to drug metabolism here. To remind us that P450, the cytochrome P450 system is named this because these are the enzymes that fluoresce. They light up when you shine a light on them at 450 nanometers. So these are the things that light up. These things have a interesting kind of nomenclature to them. It's like a zip code or postal code in our country. So they're called CYP, a letter number. 3A4 is an example of the family, subfamily, and isoform. Of the hundreds of cytochromes that we have, there are 3 that are critically important: 3A4, 2D6, and 1A2. Why are they important? Because they're the ones that metabolize the majority of drugs that we take, and 3A4 in particular is responsible for half of the drugs that we take. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit sensitized that we should really be thoughtful about the things that are going into our body. But then you're still wondering, what the heck does cannabis have to do with this? Well, cannabis and THC and CBD in particular are metabolized through 3A4. Think of that like the major highway in your state. And if you roll a whole bunch of cars onto that highway and then put in a couple of cars that are slow movers or that are dysfunctional, that's going to create a terrible traffic jam. 3A4, as we said, is important for a whole bunch of drugs like calcium channel blockers, benzos, cyclosporins, statins, things that we use commonly in the cardiovascular space. What's the deal with throwing in CBD? Well, CBD is a potent inhibitor of all of these things. So you're going to get more calcium channel blocker, more benzo effect, more cyclosporin effect, more statin effect in your patients just by introducing a little bit of CBD. Hey, it's just a plant, isn't it? And then on the 2D6 side, 2D6 is responsible for things like antidepressants, antipsychotics, beta blockers, opioids. Once again, if you throw CBD in the mix, all of these things, their metabolism is going to slow down. You're going to get a whole lot more of it in your body. What's been interesting watching over the last couple of years is that there's been more reports of this stuff. And this is the website in Canada that talks about some of the drug kind of safety issues. FDA in the States and MedWatch would be your equivalent of this. And it just happens to be that in last month's journal article, they talked about cannabis and warfarin as potential drug interactions. They're just discovering the stuff that you and I knew for many, many months. And the issue that they're highlighting here is that there may be reports of increased INR associated with the concurrent use of warfarin and cannabis, because cannabis, CBD in particular, is going to mess around with how warfarin gets metabolized. You get more warfarin, higher INR, more potential for bleeding. There's been several case reports in Canada, the US, and internationally about this. So that Jack article actually calls this out in a little bit more detail about which cytochromes might get inhibited by which of the cannabinoids. You can look at this very thoughtfully now, because you know what a CYP letter number actually means and where drug levels may change. For our case, when she asks you that innocent question of what's the best pot for me, and you might respond by saying, I think you need a little bit of CBD. It has no THC. It's going to be safe for you. Well, the story is actually quite cautious. And we may be increasing the effects of all of these things and decreasing the effect of this stuff. And here are all the things that we're going to watch for. So suppose she goes and buys her own CBD, because you can do that in Montana now or in the near future, and starts to introduce it. Suppose she shows up in cardiac rehab, bradycardic and hypotensive, and saying all her muscle aches. And when she's on telemetry, if you do telemetry, she's starting to throw arrhythmias because her amitriptyline levels are too high, or she's got more bruising because her INR's gone out of control. And by the way, the codeine that she was taking for her pain control, that actually doesn't work anymore, because the CBD is messing around with how codeine actually gets activated. So it doesn't work. Boy, that's an interesting kind of outcome from an innocent kind of conversation, and a well-intentioned kind of recommendation for her to just add in a little bit of CBD. So that's fun, isn't it? So my last slide here, and then I'd love to turn it to some questions, is a nice infographic from the Jack article. And maybe you can pull this out just to say that this can be a big issue, because at least 2 million Americans are taking cannabis, and probably more, because they don't want to tell you this. So we need to be aware of this, and we need to be aware that cannabis can be associated with a whole bunch of adverse cardiovascular risks, and that there is more THC in products in time, and that users are much more creative in how they're going to use this stuff to enhance the high. We should ask about this, just like in our common thing now, just like we would ask about tobacco use and alcohol and other drug products, then add the question about cannabis as well. But do it in a friendly, kind of welcoming way. We understand you may be using it. Just tell us what you're using and how. But then go through that discussion with kind of just highlighting where we might get into some concerns in the discussion, like if you're taking simvastatin and amlodipine and warfarin, then these might honestly be affected by the stuff you're taking by oil or capsule or things that you are smoking. And what we're all looking for in the bottom here is that there should hopefully be some better studies coming along. And one study that I looked at just yesterday had some really good methodology around how they are formulating, how they're studying the stuff, and so to give us some really good answers on the risks and the benefits truly. All right, I am stopping there, Casey, to field some questions, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for some interactive discussion.
Well, thank you, Dr. O. We appreciate that presentation. There's a lot of information, a lot of things for us to think about. I know I definitely learned way too much on that one that I have to try to slow down and digest now. So, but thank you again for the presentation. I want to take a moment to say thanks to Mike too for setting up the webinar and running it for us for this presentation. And then I just want to take a moment to say thanks to the MACVPR board for stepping up and finding a way that we can still get education out to our area during these situations that we're dealing with. That said, Mike, I'm going to kick it over to you to go over Q&A if we have some there, and Dr. O, if you don't mind answering a few of those.
No, I'd love to.
Great. Thanks, Casey. Thanks, Dr. O. That was really good. Just a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and put it into the Q&A. The question that I have is that because of how marijuana is classified in the United States, it makes it almost impossible to do, really good research studies on it. How come we're not seeing more research come from other countries that may not have the restrictions that the U.S. has on it? Because I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, and I think it's just a matter of time, Michael, that there are a lot of protocols that are underway. But you're right that the largest, I guess, think tank around drug research has been kind of hampered in its ability to do cannabis. There's there are even kind of national research grants that were set up last year specifically to look at issues related to cannabis. Like in our shop, it's not only thinking about the usual medical safety, but other kind of societal issues like driver safety related to cannabis. As you say, you couldn't do that research before, but now in jurisdictions where there is a more legalized framework, we can start to do some of those things. So we're gonna see, I think, more research month by month that will be helpful to inform our discussions.
Great, thank you. And then regarding kind of some of the acute impact that it has on reaction time in terms of people getting on and getting off treadmills and just safety with balance and stuff like that. Are we seeing any negative impacts that it may have on things like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it would be logical. Certainly if there was somebody who was naive to any cannabis products and they just started up, that might be quite challenging. I think the more common scenario that and it just may come out of the woodwork, right? People just may be more willing to talk about it now that there's a more legalized framework. So if there are or the people that have been accessing medical cannabis for some time. And I believe that's been the situation in Montana for a while. People that are on chronic products, and they find their balance with CBD plus or minus THC, that, they're good with that. And on a chronic sense, I don't think that their reaction times or ability to walk or navigate will be affected, but certainly the acute intoxication, that's clearly not a time to be putting folks on a treadmill. So, having the awareness up front and going back to, are you using any products? Oh yeah, which one? And well, what are you using it for? And how long have you been using it? And then asking the question, do you think it causes any impairment? Or for other folks, it would be, what they'll say to us is, unless I use my my cannabis product. Like unless I take my CBD oil in capsule, I won't be able to walk on a treadmill because I'll be in a lot of pain. So it's interesting. You may get the opposite response from folks.
Great. And do we know the mechanism of why we see an increased heart rate? What's actually causing that?
Yeah, so the endocannabinoid system is very complex. The receptors all over the body, we focus on the ones in the brain around the high, but there are receptors distributed through the cardiovascular system, the intestinal system elsewhere. The circulation article does a nice kind of pathophysiologic discussion about that. Part of it may be related to like sympathetic activation as well. And I think probably you folks can appreciate that just as well as I can in terms of the at least the heart rate stimulation and some of the irritability that may come around with that.
Okay. All right, great. That's all the questions that I have in the Q&A box. So thanks a lot, Dr. O. That was outstanding. And this is recorded and we'll get it posted to the MACVPR website as soon as we can. And we'll get that info out to the group. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Casey. Thank you to you all for joining in. And my own thanks to the MACVPR for the opportunity to link with you all remotely. Okay. Have a great day.